Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Litkey, the Director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. Welcome again to our annual once-a-month Lunch and Learn series. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Richard Quinlan, the Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education at St. Elizabeth University. Dr. Quinlan will be speaking about Burundi, and in Pacific, that it is a landlocked nation in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa, largely known as a Rwandan neighborhood. Tragically, it is a country that has also suffered 2 genocides and continues to wrestle with violence of its past. And we welcome him today. Just as a side note, we met as colleagues. Richard reached out to learn more about us because he's new to his position out east. And when he was telling me what he was doing, I seized every opportunity to have someone educate us, and he agreed wonderfully to be one of our presenters. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you. I really do appreciate this opportunity. Tremendous colleague. Scott's been a huge help for me. And thank you to all of you for joining us today and joining me. And yes, I am going to discuss the small nation of Burundi, a nation that very, very upsettingly has not garnered anywhere near the attention that some of her neighbors have in terms of having, unfortunately, a very violent history, but there is hope. And I think that's going to be one of the themes today, that Burundi is a nation that is attempting to change, attempting to reconcile, and attempting to move forward from a past that continues to haunt it. Now, the plan for today is to discuss briefly genocide in Africa, just do a very, very quick little synopsis on that, talk about the experiences within Burundi, and then finally discuss where the country is headed. And trust me when I tell you, I am not trying to put sort of a pretty bow on a very, very difficult situation, but I do like to conclude with a sense of optimism and a belief that nations, despite whatever they have endured in the past, do have pathways to success and rebuilding. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, I thank you so much for being a part of this today. And please let me know if everyone can see what we're looking at. Beautiful. Thank you again. So in terms of genocide in Africa, there is a long history of it, quite tragically. One of the worst, which does not necessarily, again, generate much attention, is what transpired in German Southwest Africa. And this is in the very, very early 1900s. In fact, it even predates the Armenian genocide that, of course, began in 1915. The targets were the Hororo and the Nama people. Now, this took place, again, German Southwest Africa, and it has only been very, very recently that the German government has actually admitted that this transpired. The country largely affected is today modern-day Mauritania, and that is a nation that actually petitioned the UN for some form of sort of acknowledgement of their suffering. So we have seen Germany in very recent years finally admit that this transpired. And of course, genocide in Africa is a widespread issue. Many nations have been impacted by incredible violence, and on very different levels have either enjoyed, if you want to use that term, reconciliation, and seen themselves actually become thriving nation, while others continue to be mired in a very, very painful past. Now, I'm trying if I can to move on to my next slide. I might just do it manually like this. So as you can see by this chart here, this idea of a litany of suffering, the atrocities that have occurred across the continent of Africa have been quite distinct, because in many ways, and this is what we're going to discuss today with Burundi, it is neighbor killing neighbor. There is a personal an intimacy to this violence that makes some of these genocides, particularly in Rwanda and Burundi, a little bit different from what we have seen in other parts of the world. And Scott and I were actually discussing this before our program began today. One aspect of genocide that we have to be very, very cautious about is the idea of ranking suffering. So I am not here to say that Burundi's experiences are in any way worse or more painful than Rwanda. We have to look at all of this suffering, individually, and understand that each nation, each ethnicity, each people have suffered in a very unique way. And so therefore, moving past this suffering has to be addressed in an equally unique way. And what is so tragic to me, and what is just so extraordinarily painful, is to look at this map. The crimes of genocide and massacre since World War II. And as we well know, as those of us who are, of course, as everyone here, well aware of the Holocaust and the legacy of the Holocaust, that phrase "never again" became something within sort of the global lexicon after the Second World War. And in a very real way, in a very upsetting way, that idea of never again has not come to fruition. And we have seen genocides take place around the world since 1945. And you look specifically at the continent of Africa, and you can see the widespread suffering that this land has endured. And the continent of Africa, in my opinion, is potentially the future of the 21st century. There are so many natural resources. There's so much room for technological advancement and growth. But one of the aspects that tends to hold Africa back from that progress is the wrestling with its past. And in some cases, countries that are still dealing with the reality of what transpired, and in the case of Burundi, actually denying on a certain level what transpired. So here, of course, are deeply disturbing images from Rwanda. And you see that image there of the young man scarred. Understand that what transpired in Rwanda had, as I mentioned, neighbor killing neighbor. But they were, without exaggeration or hyperbole, staring each other in the eye as they murdered their victims. It was with daggers, machetes, even gardening tools. So again, it's that deeply personal style of violence that separates Rwanda and Burundi from some of the other genocides that we have studied. Now let's talk about Burundi. And we're going to look at the history of genocide, aspects of retribution, but as I mentioned, also the idea of reconciliation. Now, the Burundian population is made up of ethnicities that we're quite familiar with because of the attention that Rwanda garnered in 1994. And that is the Tutsi, the Hutu, and then a very, very small percentage of the Burundian population called the Twa. Now, obviously, what we're dealing with today is violence between Tutsi and Hutu. Now, originally, the nation of Rwanda-Urundi was a German colony. It was lost. It was taken away from Germany following World War I and was placed under the control of Belgium. Now, the Tutsi are a minority within Burundi. In fact, roughly 85% of the country is Hutu. But the Belgians looked at the Tutsi and decided in their eyes that the Tutsi appeared, and the usual description is, more European. They were taller, generally less stocky than the Hutu, had different facial features, and the Belgians decided that the Tutsi should be the group placed in positions of power, politically, militarily, economically, and therein lies the root of the struggle that will take place within a beautiful country. But again, in terms of that idea of ranking suffering, Rwanda and Burundi are sometimes referred to as false twins. That term was coined by René Lamarchand, really the leading expert in the study of Burundian genocide. As Scott mentioned in his intro, Burundi is a very small, landlocked nation in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa. It's roughly the size of Maryland. Now, if you went back only to roughly 2018, the population of Burundi was roughly 12 million people. Incredibly, that has grown today to over 13 million. Now, one of the most important numbers about Burundi, and believe me, I am not a numbers man. However, understand that the median age of Burundi is 17. And I mention that for one very, very important reason. Reconciliation and progress belongs to the young. The youth of Burundi are no longer concerned about who is Hutu and who is Tutsi. In fact, some younger Burundians that I had an opportunity to speak with while I was doing my dissertation told me that's our grandparents' life. We don't think about that. In fact, in Burundi, a very common greeting used to be, hello, are you Hutu or Tutsi? That would be the very first question. And young Burundians today do not ask that. They do not think that way. Intermarriage, friendships are part of their everyday lives, which offers us hope for this country moving forward. Now, in 1972, Burundi tragically experienced its first genocide. Now, what is interesting to note is that there was a world leader in 1972 who was deeply troubled by this genocide and wanted to speak out against it. And that world leader was President Richard Nixon. Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor at the time, told Nixon, it really isn't worth speaking out. In Kissinger's words, the relationship between the United States and Burundi was microscopic. He said, really, all we do is buy some coffee from that country. So the United States did not speak out about what was taking place in 1972. And so this genocide was able to take place largely shrouded in darkness. The rest of the world not speaking out about it. And whenever we have this kind of violence in the shadows, then not only does it remain unknown to the world, but it also allows for an issue that we see in Burundi even today. There are politicians in Burundi in 2022 that deny that the 1972 genocide ever happened. And the impetus behind this wave of violence involved the fact that, once again, it is largely centered around the Tutsi being placed in positions of power. The Hutu being extraordinarily frustrated, alienated, and ostracized. So when they rise up against what they see as unfair Tutsi dominance in their country, their uprisings are violently and viciously crushed. Now you may wonder, well, how exactly does that happen? If the Hutu are such a majority in the country, how are they able to be so overwhelmingly destroyed when they have these uprisings? Well, the Tutsi control the military. And if you control the military, you control the weapons. And so therefore, what took place was almost unimaginable violence being carried out by the Tutsi against the Hutu. Now, if you see there on the screen, the conventional estimates for the number of people killed in 1972 is somewhere between 100 and 300,000. That's a pretty broad range. But understand that that range is what it is because the exact number of deaths is still being discussed today. Bodies and mass graves are still found in Burundi today, dating back to 1972. In fact, there's an image from February of 2020 where there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established in Burundi. And I will discuss that a little bit because while certainly on one level, whenever you have a TRC created in a country, that's a positive step forward and something that rightfully should be celebrated. Tragically, it was short-lived. But what you see is the unearthing of more mass graves. And so not only will Burundi deal with an extraordinary tragedy in 1993, but they are still trying to address what happened in 1972. In regards to that killing, Mr. Lamarchand said, and this is a quote that very tragically sums up Burundian history. He said, "Few people care, and fewer still know enough about the country to challenge public indifference about its destinies." Now, that was given in testimony in 1988. And here we are in 2022, still having the same debate, still having the same discussion. Very few people know about Burundi, understand its past, and again, in a way to not in any way sound crass or dismissive, but again, few people care. Now, when we start talking about leadership in Burundi, you're going to notice a trend. And that trend is going to be a series of coups. And it begins in 1976 with Jean-Baptiste Bagaza. Now, he rules Burundi until 1987, which is going to be just prior to a mass killing in 1988. So think about that for a moment. You have two genocides, 72, 93, but then there's even a mass killing in 1988. So the amount of bloodshed that this tiny yet extraordinarily beautiful country has endured is almost unimaginable. Now, you're going to notice a series of mistakes made by Burundian leaders. And to be fair, some of these mistakes are perhaps done with the best of intentions. For example, Bagaza attempted to unify the country by saying that Kirundi will be the only language spoken in Burundi. Well, here's the problem. Kirundi was a language that was spoken largely and almost exclusively among the elites, both within, by the way, the Hutu and Tutsi ethnicities, but the elites within those groups. So it doesn't unify the country at all. In fact, what it really does is create a very clear line of demarcation between the haves and the have-nots, because if you're speaking Kirundi, then you were clearly among a more upper class. And this attempt at a unified Burundi is going to take place on more than one occasion. And unfortunately, either through poor leadership or just the fact that the nation wasn't quite ready for it at the time, this idea of one Burundi doesn't really take place. Now, as I mentioned, the youth today are in a better position to adopt such a theory and such an idea, and they are, in a very real way, trying to work towards it. But we'll discuss some of the political issues that, again, are holding the nation back. Now, Pierre Buyoya leads another bloodless coup in 1987. And look what he talks about: one Burundi. Once again, this angers the Hutu, who essentially say, how can there be one Burundi? How can we talk about equality and unification when the vast majority of the population is denied so many different opportunities to improve their lives? Once again, we see an uprising by the Hutu. Once again, we see that uprising met with extraordinary violence. And in 1988, there was, again, as I mentioned, that mass killing, almost 20,000 people killed. In 1993, Melchior Ndadaye becomes the first democratically elected Hutu leader of Burundi. What a tremendous step forward. This is a huge step for the country. 4 months later, he's brutally assassinated. And so you see that the story of Burundi, in many ways, is one step forward, 2 or 3 steps back. And in 1993, we see that explosion of violence that marks the second genocidal wave in the country. Once again, it's a Hutu uprising. This time, responding to the death of the president. And what Hutu were saying in 1993, and this is a bit of a chilling phrase, back in 72, they got us. This time, they won't. And it's the use of that word they that's so disturbing, because what we really see is that idea of a certain level of attempting to dehumanize the Tutsi. They got us, the other. And of course, that concept of the other is one of the fundamental aspects of genocides that we have seen across the decades and around the world. In 1993, the death toll of the genocide is somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000. Now, in 1994, we see the election of Cyprien Tariamra. However, and this is largely forgotten when people discuss the Rwandan genocide, the president of Burundi was on board the plane that was shot down in 94 that kickstarted the Rwandan genocide. So Burundi even has a direct connection to what transpired in Rwanda, yet so few people talk about Burundi. Rwanda became an international name. Now, perhaps because of the shocking brutality, 100 days long. And again, the estimates in Rwanda are around 800,000 people killed. So obviously that is an event that is again, really almost unimaginable in scope. But what it did was relegate Burundi to sort of the back of people's minds, if on their minds at all. The Burundian Civil War went on for years. So not only do you have 2 genocides, not only do you have mass killings, but now you're wrapped up in a civil war. 25,000 Tutsis were killed in the wake of the death of Nadaye. We have not only this vast death toll, but also keep in mind that an aspect of genocide, of course, are refugees, both those who are internally displaced, as well as those, of course, who are attempting to flee the violence. Over 800,000 Burundians went into Tanzania and even went into Rwanda. So you had people fleeing violence, going into a nation that itself had been paralyzed by violence. And you'll have a country like Tanzania that was not equipped to be able to accept and properly address the issue of this mass of refugees running for their lives. And you see this scene here, where bodies just laid out in open fields, the vast majority of these individuals remaining completely unknown. And so you have, once again, mass graves, the disposal of bodies whose identities are known only to their family members. And of course, becoming tragically a historical footnote. Now, in the year 2000, the Burundian Civil War comes to a close. There is the signage of an agreement called the Arusha Peace Accords. And as you can see there, some of the negotiations were indeed brokered by Nelson Mandela. So you have just perhaps the most well-known figure in Africa, maybe alongside Desmond Tutu, sitting and hoping Burundi move forward. In a very, very upsetting way, the lasting results of the Arusha Accords have not really been what the hope was. There was tremendous excitement and encouragement about Burundi's future in 2000. But one other point should be mentioned, and you can see that in the two images here. No women took part in these negotiations. That's a significant issue, obviously not only for Burundi, but focusing largely on Burundi. The women of that country, who, as we well know, women suffer very uniquely within genocide, not just during the killings themselves and the violence that they face, but the fact that they are alive in an effort to rebuild the country. They've watched their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their husbands murdered in these waves of violence. And it falls upon them to now find avenues of reconciliation. But one has to wonder, how does that truly happen if women's voices are not heard at the negotiating table? So while Arusha is a step forward, and obviously, again, whenever nations are attempting to demonstrate progress coming out of extraordinary darkness, it needs to be celebrated. But there were limits and problems with this agreement. Now, I'm not going to read, obviously, this entire quote, but there's something very, very significant here that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. Paul Nentulia was a Burundian politician who I had the honor of speaking with during my research. And he said private media played a critical role in Burundi. Before the May 2015 crackdown on independent media, Burundi was one of the most developed countries in the Great Lakes region from the perspective of independent media and freedom of expression. This facilitated public discussion on taboo subjects like ethnicity. Traditional restorative justice practices, such as including community elders, guided the mediation process. Now, that crackdown on free media that he addresses that took place in 2015 is one of the most important missteps taken by Burundian leadership. Because, of course, when you begin to silence those who want to address the truth, whether it be Hutu-Tutsi relations or the legacy of Burundian genocide, you have a country that becomes mired in essentially unable to truly reconcile and move forward. Now, the man largely responsible for that crackdown is this individual, Pierre Nkurunziza. Now, Nkurunziza became president in 2005. In 2015, he ran for a third term, something originally agreed in the Arusha Accords would not be allowed to happen. He even contemplated running for an unprecedented fourth term in 2020. There was extraordinary fear and profound worry in 2020 that Burundi again could explode into violence, this time with an anger over political corruption. Now, ultimately, and fortunately for the country, he did not run again. And it's with a certain sense of irony here how we mention his passing, because the Burundian government, in the midst of the pandemic, claimed that Burundi didn't have any COVID cases. In fact, just as a side note, Burundi was actually the second to last country in Africa to accept international donations of vaccines, claiming they didn't need it. The only other country that lasted longer in terms of denying the vaccine was Eritrea. And as we well know, Eritrea is not a country where you really want to be keeping company. And again, I mentioned a certain irony that this man's death was attributed to COVID. So you had a denier who tragically, again, passed away. In May of 2020, we see the ascension of Evariste Ndayishimiye. Now, when he became president, he was very, very public in saying that his government was going to be far more transparent, that he would have a willingness to discuss topics that largely had been considered off the table. Understand that in 2015, what did happen in Burundi in terms of that crackdown on independent media is that organizations like the BBC, Voice of America, were forced to shut down their offices. In fact, even AIDS groups were thrown out. So organizations like Doctors Without Borders, for example, were being told that they were somehow a threat instead of being an organization that should have been welcomed as providing the necessary assistance that Burundi required. Now, to be fair, his promise of transparency actually began in a very significant way. In fact, just last spring, the Burundian Senate actually began to have public discussions about the 1972 genocide. And one of the great experiences of my life was I was actually invited and allowed to speak via Zoom to the Burundian Senate about some of the research that I did in 1972. And as you can imagine, it was a very interesting meeting because the camera actually panned across the room as I was presenting. And as you may imagine, there were some rather befuddled looks as to who this guy was who was speaking to the Senate from his kitchen table at the time I was living in Huntington, Long Island. So, and at one point, the camera left the members of the Senate and came to a table of Burundian soldiers who were in full uniform, and they were staring straight into the camera. And even though I was thousands of miles away, it was honestly one of the most intimidating moments of my life. I thought, I don't really think these guys are particularly interested in what I have to say. But sadly, these public discussions were later shut down. So perhaps the topic began to be a little too painful and something that the government simply did not want to address. Now, as we know, whenever the truth is silenced, it opens up the possibility for conspiracy theories, for denial. And even though for those of us looking from the outside, when you see that 4,000 mass graves have been discovered in Burundi, the government says it simply isn't true. And for the people of Burundi who are struggling to have access to the truth, there are those who believe what the government says, that these mass graves are not actually being discovered. It's some kind of plot. It's simply an exaggeration of what transpired. But we know quite well this is real. And those genocides in 72 and 93 absolutely happened. There was even a report in 2020 that verified 68 mass graves. Now, let me just go back for one quick moment. 4,000 have been discovered. The government admits to 68. And you're looking at over 1,400 bodies or 1,400 human remains that were found that were, through carbon dating, connected back to 1972. So the brutality that took place in 72 cannot be denied. The physical evidence is there. Yet, the public is largely being told, do not believe what your eyes tell you. It's not 4,000 mass graves. It's less than 70. Now, I included this individual here. He became a very, very good friend of mine, and we still communicate quite regularly. He was a centerpiece of my research. He's a man named Desiree Nimyunbona. He is an independent journalist. He has a collection of individuals who are writing and reporting in a very real way, risking their lives to work for very little money in an effort to expose the truth about what happened. And he is largely the individual through whom I was allowed to speak in front of the Senate. Now, Burundi today, and I'll wrap up here in just a few moments. Burundi today is an interesting country. Despite its size, it's very, very rich in natural resources. And as we have seen in numerous countries throughout Africa, one nation that is very interested in it is China. Now, as a token of China's interest, the Chinese government paid for the building of an absolutely majestic presidential palace in the city of Bujumbura, which for decades was the Burundian capital. Well, one small problem. In 2019, the Burundian government decided to move the capital away from Bujumbura to its more historically accurate capital of Gitega. So Burundi, as poor as it is, and we'll talk about its poverty in just a sec, has a $22 million building largely empty. And it's a symbolic encapsulation of where the country is. There's a step, 1 foot, if you will, in modernity, yet also these tremendous struggles. And for those of you who are interested in this, I always do find this sort of fascinating. There is something known as the World Happiness Index. And in 2021, Burundi rated 146 out of a possible 156 countries. And in case you're interested in traveling, Finland was number 1, the United States, 19th. So Burundi has real struggles. And one of the best examples of these challenges involves electricity. It is almost a remarkable number. Less than 5% of the rural population in Burundi has access to electricity. It's still just under 50% in the urban areas. Now, the current government has promised full electricity for the country by 2025, which is an extraordinarily bold promise. We'll have to certainly wait and see. Very, very recently, there has been greater outside foreign investment in Burundi, as well as some internal or local trade agreements, countries coming together to try to lift each other up in the Great Lakes region. As you can see, Burundi, the Congo, and other surrounding nations within the Great Lakes have actually very recently, in fact, just in June, signed an agreement called the Great Lakes Trade Facilitation and Integration Project. And it's largely funded by the World Bank. It's a $250 million international development association helping small-scale farmers and women. And so this is a very positive step. This is what I talk about, that hope for Burundi's future. This is one such example, because the people who are being aided the most by this trade agreement are those who need assistance the most. So we're beginning to see money targeting the most critical aspects of Burundian society. The United States. I started this discussion talking about how Richard Nixon knew what was happening in 1972. Well, the United States continues to have a relationship with Burundi. And yes, on a certain level, Kissinger was right. The United States does import, or its most significant import from Burundi is coffee. And if I may, as an aside, for those of you who are coffee drinkers, Burundian coffee is extraordinary. If you can find it, never say no to it. It's truly great. But you look at some of these numbers, and Burundi, unfortunately, has a tremendous trade deficit. So you see these obstacles in front of the country that it's attempting to hurdle. And some have been self-inflicted. There is no doubt about that. And Burundi has to address that. But an event like the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously impacted the entire globe, was obviously going to hurt a nation like Burundi with extraordinary suffering, and that is what transpired. So to begin to sum up, when we look at the ideas of truth, reconciliation, and a country trying to unify and heal itself, it's a very difficult process. And it's a very difficult process for any country. But for a nation like Burundi that has suffered two incredibly disturbing genocidal events and a certain unwillingness of political officials to discuss these events, the idea of bringing the nation together is profoundly challenging. However, we think about why this matters and consider what the youth of Burundi are saying today. They want a better future. They want education, job opportunities, the ability for Burundi to become a player within the international stage, particularly concerning trade. And we can look to the future of Burundi with a certain hope because of the young, because the country is so young. You have those who are actively attempting to pressure the government in a way that they can finally begin to achieve the long-standing goals. Lastly, why study Burundi? Well, because Burundi encapsulates what genocide can do to a country. We have to consider this nation because we see what hate speech does. We see what personal responsibility means and that idea of being an upstander, that we're not enough in Burundi. And remember, the genocides do not begin with mass graves. They don't begin with tanks or bullets. They begin with words. They begin with language. And if we don't stop hate speech, if we don't step in and call it out in all of its forms, wherever it may be, we see tragedies like those that we witnessed in Burundi. So thank you very much for your time. And I see that there's a few things popping up in the chat. Wonderful.
Rich, if you take us off of shared screen so we can all be
Oh, certainly.
that first.
Do that.
Thank you. That was superb. Unbelievable. Really appreciate you being here and presenting. That was really, really thought-provoking. Steve Weiss, who is the son of a survivor, a part of our governance council for IHE, and also a part of our speakers bureau, has a couple of questions. Steve,
Sure.
take yourself off mute.
Can you further describe the differences between the Tutsi and Hutu and how these developed? You got a very small country and yet seemingly very separate entities. And the second question I have is further references for additional reading.
Certainly. So I'll address the first question first. The Tutsi and Hutu had, or have, I should say, differences, as I mentioned, even physically. The Hutu tended to be more rugged, stocky farmers. The Tutsi, again, in the eyes of the Belgians, were more European. They were less engaged with sort of this as physical type of work. And the Belgians even mentioned some of the writing that the width of their noses, the size of their foreheads were different and therefore more acceptable within a European perspective. And so obviously, as we've talked about with the Holocaust, when we've talked about other genocides, that idea of physical appearance and what that means. In terms of further reading, anything by Lamanchon, he's written several works, some just about Burundi, and others comparing Rwanda and Burundi. And he is a remarkable scholar. He taught at universities in various places. He actually taught at Florida State for years. He's an older man now and lives in France. I'm unsure really of his health, but he is a brilliant mind. So anything he does is tremendous.
If you could put his name in the chat, be
Sure.
helpful. What you're describing in terms of these facial characteristics sounds very, very eugenic-like, what the Nazis used.
Yeah, positively. And you know, it's just interesting to note that, of course, Rwanda, Urundi actually began as a German territory before being handed over to the Belgians following the Treaty of Versailles. But you know, that's an incredibly astute point, because you see the similarities that really run through almost all genocides, and so there are these commonalities that so tragically come to define these events.
Paula, you have a question? Just take yourself off mute.
Yes, I wanted to talk more about the women, and particularly I had an opportunity to meet Immaculée Ilibagiza, who wrote Left to Tell, and her experience of being held by her Hutu pastor, and she was Tutsi, and then her entire family was killed. Can you speak more to the positivity of the future for the women?
What made me happy, to use that phrase, is that when I spoke to the Burundian Senate, I saw a large number of women who were part of that Senate and part of those discussions. And that is, again, something to be celebrated. There are many stories. I have a dear friend of mine who travels to Rwanda quite frequently and does reconciliation work with women. And she talked about how at the beginning of one session, the Hutu and Tutsi women sat on opposite sides of the room, would even infrequently make eye contact. Over the course of the program, where they began to share their pain, they ended up singing together. And so what women realize is that there is this shared, very distinctive kind of suffering that happens through genocide. And I think it's very clear to the women of Burundi, particularly younger women of Burundi. Again, I keep coming back to that age, that median age. And it's also women in Burundi who are raising their voices as well. You know, there was in a conversation I had when I was doing my research, when I asked about the Arusha Accords, and I asked an interviewee, I said, well, can you tell me about the impact and the influence of women? And the first thing he did was laugh. And I said, well, that pretty much sums up the answer. And that always stuck with me. And so it's something that again is a very positive step forward to see Burundian women more engaged, and also with voices that are becoming increasingly more significant.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Steve, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, perhaps I'm a little off the track of genocide, but certainly there are a number of significant humanitarian crises across the globe. And I referenced the book by Bernard Henry Levy, The Will to See, that documents these. It's not just genocide, it's rather significant humanitarian issues across the globe.
Oh, positively, which of course in some ways are building blocks to genocide.
Yeah,
When you think of, poverty, food insecurity, government corruption, any kind of repression that you see, whether it be, for example, the elimination of freedom of speech or freedom of the press, all of these are contributing factors to genocide. So you're 1,000% correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Your comments regarding the denial of COVID that occurred in that country, it's very similar to what occurred during Yemen. There's an excellent documentary on Frontline about that crisis.
I saw that, and you're absolutely right. And you think about the contemporary genocides that are happening right now that are also largely out of the news forefront. I mean, we think about the Syrian refugee crisis a number of years ago, and that was sort of the lead story and garnering so much attention. But now it's obviously fallen away from in terms of much news coverage. And in talking with students and talking with others, I've had people say, well, it's over, right? I don't hear about it anymore, so everything must be fine. And so that's obviously a very real problem, because unless we work towards keeping these events in the news and at the forefront of people's attention, it's very easy for these tragedies just to kind of fall aside and largely be ignored.
Other questions?
Well, it looks like
Rich, did you have a chance to visit in the country, or was it all done virtually?
Well, unfortunately, my research was all done during the pandemic, so I did not have a chance to travel. I do have one interesting story. I spoke with an organization called Burundi and Friends. They were out in San Diego, and I spoke with a woman about traveling there. And she said, well, it's fairly easy, fly from New York to Nairobi to Bujumbura. She said, we can get you there. Just can't guarantee you'll get out. And I said, well, I'm not really that brave. I would love to do field research, but I also would like to return home. So again, my friend Desiree and I have talked about me trying to visit. It's largely believed if you travel as part of a religious organization, that there's a greater sense of security, but it remains obviously an unsettled place to be. Interesting.
Any other questions?
I did have one more comment.
Please.
In 1994, Guatemala was going through a similar kind of, I don't know that they've ever identified it as genocide, but it was, and not as brutal as what you experienced in your research, Richard. But I think the thing that bothers me the most is so many of these places are not, no one even realizes that they were going on. And the United States, unfortunately, in Guatemala, they didn't want to hear about it because of our companies that were there, the United States and Canada, Gold, and then of course, the Dole Company and some of those kinds of things that were happening. They did not do a single thing to help out Guatemala, and not even to the point of recognizing it. Do you have a comment about that?
There's actually a phrase that is used very frequently called forgotten genocides. And Guatemala certainly represents that. And there are, in fact, I believe Lamarchand actually contributed to a text I think it was, I believe it's called Africa's Forgotten Genocides. I could be wrong on that, but it's very much along those lines. And you raise a tremendous point that when you sit and look at how many of these atrocities have transpired around the world, it's staggering. Either we don't know much about them, or we know nothing at all. And economics often ties into that. Think about 1972 with Kissinger. Listen, why care about Burundi? It's some coffee. We don't need to worry about that. Or the reliance upon certain nations for trade. And so therefore, once again, you close your eyes to human rights abuses because economics trumps morality. And it's a deeply disturbing truth. But I think all we can do, because people often ask, I'm one individual, how do I stop genocide? The reality is one person won't. But if we begin to work and just write articles and pressure and do anything we can to bring these events to people's awareness, then that's a step. And at least it's something.
So with that in mind, Steve asked, and I was going to be my question too, are you going to publish your dissertation in book form so that this gets out even further?
I'm working on it. One of the chapters that I'm refining is actually my chapter devoted to women, because I just think that is a central point that impacts so many global atrocities. So that I'm currently working on.
Wonderful. Any other questions? Rich, I want to thank you. I'm so glad that you and I had a chance to meet over the summer virtually and hopefully one day in person. This is an amazing presentation. I'd like to invite all of you next month when we have Professor Mike Kelly from Creighton University from the law school, the professor that we work with, IHE works with the Nuremberg to the Hague program, is going to be presenting on the full gamut of the program, not just the area of Poland that we work on with them. And I hope that you all have a wonderful Hanukkah and Shabbos and holiday season. And Rich, again, thank you so much. This is absolutely amazing.
Scott, absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for attending, and your questions were amazing. And I really do appreciate this greatly. So thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Rich, I look forward to seeing you at our next CHEC meeting.
Same, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Pleasure. Nice to see all of you.